When I first thought about making a video on Muttski, Sonic's dog with the most aggressively 90s name you've ever heard, I thought it would be just this quick, fun, and maybe a little bit silly video. I mean, come on, he's a dog named Muttski. But then I started digging, and as I dug, I uncovered this whole rabbit hole of information that honestly no one was ever meant to look so closely into, but I of course did. So, who is Muttski? Well, Muttski is Sonic's loyal dog. Like the Freedom Fighters, he was brought over from the Sad AM TV show, and like most of Sonic's family, Muttski gets roboticized pretty early on. But here's where the patented Archie weirdness starts to come in. Some aliens would end up deciding to de-roboticize everyone, except for Sonic's dad, because reasons that honestly aren't worth getting into. But Muttski, for the most part, throughout the majority of Archie, is a cute dog and not a terrifying robot. Now, Muttski's kind of like that old childhood toy that you loved but completely forgot about at your parents' house, and it's been sitting in a box of your childhood stuff ever since. Muttski spends all of his time at Sonic's parents'. He's more of a background character, and because Sonic is always off saving the world, there's not really any time for walkies with Muttski. Even when Sonic comes home when he's not fighting an evil dictator, the writers are often kind of like, Muttski who? As they often seem to completely forget that he exists, and as a result, he's omitted from the household entirely sometimes when Sonic is home. But the thing that really pulled me down the Muttski rabbit hole is the fact that Muttski is a dog. In a world where Sonic and his friends are anthropomorphic animals, Muttski is just a regular dog. And that's kind of weird, right? It's not even like anthropomorphic dogs don't exist on Mobius, because we see them pretty frequently in the background. Heck, in the comic book that I was talking about just now, there's a fisherman who's pretty clearly a dog. However, aside from the fisherman, we also have Sleuth Doggy Dog, who is a character that exists, and he's an ever-constant reminder that, honestly, I think Sonic peaked with this name, and nothing has ever topped it in any kind of Sonic media. His name ultimately can only really mean one or a combination of two things. Either he is just a dog, or he just really loves Snoop Dogg. It's probably most likely that he is a dog who really loves Snoop Dogg, and I love that. So the easy answer here when comparing the dogs to the more evolved Mobius dogs would be pretty much that one's an animal and one is a Mobian. But what's kind of interesting here, and what I think is super adorable, is that the animals are called Mobinis. And according to the Archie Encyclopedia, which honestly I have become way too familiar with in the last 2 years, Mobinis are non-sentient but show striking insight, whatever that means. Hold the phone. I don't actually think that's the whole story when it comes to Mobinis, because they're a lot more than this. In fact, I'm here to tell you that Muttski, and quite frankly, probably all the Mobinis, are way more than what meets the eye. Sonic would spend a year lost in space, and no, this isn't the video where I'm going to actually go into more detail than that. He would eventually come crashing back onto Mobius, and after reuniting with some friends and family, Sonic would go back to his old family home, and after spending so much time in space, he's ready for a nap. Shortly after falling asleep, he would be awoken by none other than his trusty friend Muttski. Except here's the thing, Muttski can suddenly speak. It's also shown that Muttski has a thumb, which honestly is just interesting, and I'm pretty willing to chalk it up to just a generic art error. It would take Sonic a quick moment, but he would realize that he can understand Muttski speaking because he's had a universal translator implant inside of him while he was in space. But the really interesting detail throughout this whole interaction here is that it's very clear not only that Muttski isn't lacking in any kind of sentience, but that through his speech, he shows an understanding of emotions, and he says that he could always speak. Simply put, the Mobians around the Mobinis just can't understand them, but that doesn't mean that they lack the ability to express themselves and to speak. Muttski isn't even the only Mobini to display a decent level of sentience. Long before any of this happened, we would get an inside look of Froggy's internal monologue, and it turns out that this frog that hangs out with what is quite possibly one of the dumbest Mobians can actually think in way better sentences than Muttski can. And that's even before he ends up eating any of Chaos, so he's not even influenced by Chaos at this point. So like, that's just a frog with frog thoughts, and they go way beyond non-sentience, as it's shown that he thinks about a lot more than just trying to survive. And so the point that I'm trying to drive home here is that Mobinis are just Mobians. They aren't related to Mobians like how chimps are related to humans, but instead, these things are two of the same, and I'm going to explain to you how. So during Sonic's adventures, he would find himself in a sticky situation. His dreams would be influenced by a growling outside of a cave. While Sonic is dreaming about Muttski, outside lurks Tasmanian devils, another Mobini, and Jeffrey St. John would explain that Tasmanian devils are just Mobians that never fully evolved. But the reality of Tasmanian devils are much darker than that, and quite frankly, they're the root to all of this. We can again find some additional information about the Tasmanian devils inside of the Archie Encyclopedia. Eons ago, way before any of our interesting freedom fighters were alive, there was this time known as the Forgotten War, in which echidnas fought against the magical order of Ixis in order to prevent them from taking over the world. The echidna people would end up sending some of their top scientists to form a colony in the region of Down Under, and it's here that they would meet the Tasmanian Devil tribe. What's really cool here is that these creatures aren't the savage monsters that we've seen them in the modern day, and instead they're just kind of like a less advanced Mobian race that's in a tribal stage. Echidnas, being god-awful but loving their genetics, end up performing tests on the tribal Mobians, and the result was basically splicing up their genes until they became nothing but mindless creatures that we've seen since. They even went a step further and made it so that they couldn't even properly reproduce, as this new savage devil dog would quickly outmatch the old Tasmanian devils in birth rates to the point where Tasmanian devils are more or less extinct and have been replaced by these creatures. The Archie Encyclopedia would even mention that these new creatures are considered Mobinis. This to me is really interesting because obviously the writers of these various comics that have been spanning for decades didn't expect anything to get to this point, much less to have someone like me really dig into all of it. But what we essentially have left here is that Mobinis, such as dogs, aren't really that different than their Mobius counterparts. In fact, what I think to be really interesting is that this means that if we have both Sleuth Doggy Dog and Muttski, that can mean that perhaps the dog species was just late to the evolutionary party, and some of them aren't there yet, or, and honestly this is my headcanon after having gone through all of this, I think what could be really interesting is that essentially the echidnas messed with a ton of Mobian's DNA to create a bunch of subservient creatures, and it just didn't quite stick as well in the gene pool as it did with the Tasmanian devils. That's why we have dogs, and that's why we have little tiny flickies along with bird people. Now, if you are curious about, if this ever went anywhere, if they've ever really elaborated on Mobinis, the answer is very simply no. After the Super Genesis wave, Muttski would return, however, he would return in a much different way. He could talk like he did before, but now he could talk to everyone, and that's because he's a Mobian, and we'd really never see another dog existing in either Archie or IDW Sonic that I can really think of, so there's no reason for them to really tread too much into this. And when it comes to the regular little animals, they honestly just seem to avoid talking about it altogether. They still appear from time to time, but really we don't see quite much of anything from them. Which honestly is a real shame, because I think that this whole idea of like gene splicing or whatever, it's out there, but like it's out there to the point where like I could see Archie pulling off something pretty interesting with it. But anyways, this was just a fun little video digging into what exactly a Mobini is. It started with me just wanting to talk about Muttski, but oh boy, it became so much more than that for me. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you had a good time, if you learned something new, whatever, it would mean a lot if you gave it a like or subscribed or anything like that. Let me know what you thought in the comments, and honestly, if I missed anything, please let me know if you have stuff that you think you could add to this that might help either with my headcanon or work against it. I'd love to hear it. At the end of the day though, as always, I'm not your boss, so you don't have to do any of that, but I really do hope that you have a good one.